According to multiple sources, WordPress powers over 40% of websites on the internet, and WordPress installations are regularly pen-tested in some form or another, using tools like WP-Scan, which look for known vulnerabilities and misconfigurations in the platform. But what if you wanted to perform a web application pen test on WordPress, the product itself? How much time would you scope the test for? This was a question I posed on social media a couple of weeks ago, which caused quite a bit of confusion and plenty of variation in the answers. Let me address the confusion first, as this was mostly my fault for not being clear enough. On X, I tried to keep the post short so people wouldn't have to click to read the entire thing, which was my first mistake. I later added a follow-up post to clarify some things, though people still got confused. My post on LinkedIn was more straightforward and resulted in less confusion. Lesson learned, clarification is key for these thought experiments. My post on X read as follows. I have a question for anyone involved in web app pentest scoping. Imagine nobody has ever heard of WordPress before. There are no tools like WP-Scan, etc. A customer comes to you and wants you to test their new blogging software. It's WordPress. How many days testing would you scope, and why? I assumed, wrongly it seems, that the line, imagine nobody has ever heard of WordPress before, would make it clear that this wasn't just, how many days do you need to test a WordPress installation? The only reason I used WordPress as the example was because I imagine most people involved with web app pentest scoping are familiar with it and therefore wouldn't need a scoping call. I was trying to avoid asking a generic question about scoping some blogging software and getting answers like, we would need to see a demo first. Because while those are perfectly reasonable answers, I wanted some actual numbers. If you've installed, configured, or even used WordPress before, you probably don't need a demo to scope it. That was my reasoning. Is it good reasoning? I don't know, but I can't really think of a way to ask this question without giving some real-world example for people to fall back on. So to be a little clearer about what the question was actually asking, I wanted people to imagine that some software company had approached them to perform a web app pen test on a new piece of blogging software they had designed. This blogging software, for all intents and purposes, is identical to WordPress in terms of core functionality. The company would set up a test instance for you, give you as many accounts as you wanted, and wanted to know how long you need to test their product. Remember, this is a thought experiment. There is no correct answer. You can make assumptions if you need to, but the goal is to come up with a number of days you think would be sufficient. If you want to think about your answer, pause the video now. So even on LinkedIn, answers varied. Some people had a standard answer of 5 days, but I don't think in those instances they really got the question being asked. I believe the average was 10 to 15 days, and then there were some people who said up to 4 weeks or even longer. My answer is more in line with the 4 weeks plus group, and honestly, you could make a good argument for 2 to 3 months. Remember, this is a thought experiment. We're not interested in what a customer would be willing to pay. We're looking for an accurate scope of the work needed. If you think that answer is absurd, I would argue you need to read the list of features in WordPress these days. Other than the blogging functionality, which is already complex enough to warrant more than 5 days of testing, you have the ability to create pages, an entire user management system, file management, a theme editor, a plugin system, and that's before you even get to the API that WordPress has. It is vast. One of the most common objections to the question I saw was, would this really have never been pen tested before? Surely something as complex as this would have undergone many rounds of testing throughout its development. While true, I don't think it's a strong objection. Ignoring the obvious that there are always exceptions, the fact that a product has been pen tested before should not impact your scope. Firstly, because even if you ask for access to previous pen test reports, you might not get them. But also because evidence of a previous pen test is not evidence the previous pen test was done well. I've tested apps before that have undergone annual or semi-annual pen test and still found major issues. This isn't necessarily due to the competency of the previous testers, though it could be, but it may just be that the scope was too limiting. When scoping a web app, we need to consider multiple factors, but the two most important are generally the number of functions the application contains and the number of distinct user roles. You can get a fairly accurate scope from that data, but that accuracy can easily degrade if customers misunderstand the factors. I've seen customers both vastly under- and overestimate the number of functions their app has, for example. A live demonstration of the app not only helps avoid this misunderstanding, but can also highlight factors that could further delay pen testing efforts. Things like complex functionality requiring multiple steps, specific inputs, etc., or even issues like MFA requirements. Ultimately, this thought experiment was designed to make people think more about scoping pen tests. It's fairly common in the industry to default to 5 days for a standard web app test, likely because a week-long test fits nicely into schedules. In the past, I didn't have a problem with this, but the industry hasn't adjusted to evolving technologies and the vulnerabilities that come with them. The fact of the matter is we have to test for much more these days than we did 5 years ago, and that extra testing invariably takes time. The 5-day test makes little sense for the vast majority of web apps unless you are clear with the customer that the test will not be comprehensive. The other factor at play here is one I alluded to earlier: how much the customer is willing to pay and whether they think they can get a better deal elsewhere. Even a customer who wants a comprehensive test has a budget and is going to weigh the value of a longer engagement against their financial constraints. This is one of the core challenges of scoping a pen test, balancing the need for thorough coverage with the reality of budget limitations. Another issue is the expectation mismatch between pen testers and customers. A customer might assume a 5-day test is enough to fully assess their application, not realizing how many components actually require in-depth analysis. If a testing company simply agrees to a 5-day engagement without clarifying the limitations, the customer may end up with a false sense of security about the results. So what can we do about this? The key is education and communication. A proper scoping process should involve detailed discussions about the application, its complexity, and the customer's expectations. It's also important to explain the limitations of time-constrained testing. If a customer insists on a short engagement, they should at least be made aware that not all vulnerabilities may be uncovered within that time frame. This also raises another important question: what should the baseline for a standard web app pen test be? If the 5-day standard is outdated, what should replace it? Perhaps it's time for the industry to reassess and redefine the minimum viable scope for modern web applications. Maybe 10 days should be the new minimum, or maybe engagement should be explicitly broken down into phases, where customers can opt for an initial assessment, followed by a more thorough deep dive. Ultimately, the takeaway from this thought experiment is that pen test scoping is not a one-size-fits-all process. Each application is unique, and the amount of time required should reflect the complexity and security needs of the system being tested. If we want to improve the state of web application security, we need to move past arbitrary timeframes and focus on what's actually necessary to do the job right. So, what do you think? Should the standard scoping approach change? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this video interesting, consider liking it and subscribing to my channel for more cybersecurity content.